Provocative. We may agitate each other, but you.
Committed to free speech and legal consent. Upbeat and entertaining.
Heartfelt and passionate.
Hello and welcome to The Pledge. Well, worrying news emerged this week that Britain could run out of beer in days because the European supply of carbon dioxide is at an all-time low. It comes as pubs and supermarkets are facing huge demand due to warmer weather and, of course, the World Cup. Now, what we really need is a very nice, very benevolent, very generous owner of a beer company who could provide us all with copious bottles to keep us all hydrated on those hot summer afternoons. If only we knew someone who could help. OK, coming up, Nick says there are no easy answers on migration. Greg talks about football. Karen says there should be no fight over defence spending, and Afua gets personal. But first, it's me. This week, Home Secretary Sajid Javid announced a government review into the use of medical cannabis, but insisted that recreational use of the drug will remain illegal. And that's right, isn't it? With so many studies telling us prolonged cannabis use, especially in the young, can lead to schizophrenia, psychosis, addiction and some cancers. And in a major intervention, the boss of NHS England, Simon Stevens, warned legislation would lead to children believing that the drug is safe, when it isn't. But former Tory leader William Hague disagrees. He wants the government to be bold and legalise because he says we have comprehensively and irreversibly lost the war. And I say, what war? There's never been a war in this country on drugs. But there is the lie peddled by legislation zealots that decriminalising drugs will drive out the criminal gangs, when it won't. And I'm sorry, but legalising a drug linked to mental illness, violence, organised crime and road deaths is irresponsible and stupid. Just because something is regulated, it doesn't mean it's safe. And that's surely the only question with drugs. Are they safe? And if the answer is no, there can be no grounds for legalising them.
I've got quite a lot of time for William Hague. I think he's one of the more impressive politicians of our generation. And I think it's worth just looking at what he said. He said, as far as marijuana or cannabis is concerned, any war has been comprehensively and irreversibly lost. The idea that the drug can be taken off the streets and out of people's lives by the state is nothing short of deluded. Everyone sitting in a Whitehall conference room needs to recognise that, out there, cannabis is ubiquitous. And issuing orders to the police to defeat its use is about as up-to-date and relevant as asking the army to recover the empire. This battle is effectively over. Now, we've known that for quite a lot of years now. We've known that actually, and what worries me about where we've reached in cannabis is when a large enough part of the population completely ignores the law, you actually devalue the law and you devalue the process of law. And that's what I think is where we've got to on cannabis. I remember being at university and a long time ago, and mates who were smoking cannabis, someone knocked on the door, was a policeman, they got caught there, and it affected their whole lives. They got taken to court and the rest of it. Now, that doesn't happen anymore. Individual users of cannabis do not get taken to court, by and large. And it's either could be legalised or it has been legalised just by process.
The police, you know, it makes me laugh when people say we've lost a war on drugs. We've never ever fought a war on drugs because the police actually said there was a piece in the Times last year where they said that warnings and tickets for possession, fixed penalty notices have halved in the last 4 years. They just don't do it anymore. But that's not. But Greg, it's not right that they don't do it. When kids of 14, 15 are smoking cannabis, and we know that cannabis can cause schizophrenia, psychosis, anxiety, depression, all of these things. You know, I keep on hearing the argument about, well, tobacco and alcohol are legal drugs. Yes, they are. And look at the damage that they cause to society. Every year, the NHS, 3.5 billion on alcohol-related illnesses, 3.6 on tobacco.
Enough people ignore the law is what we know is happening.
Well, do we know what's happening?
Oh, yes.
How do we know? That is simply not true, because 90% of the population don't take drugs, 10% are regular users. So how are people ignoring the law?
But cannabis is something like 6%.
Actually,
Yes.
I've got the figures. I've got the figures on cannabis.
Well, I have the figures.
6.6% of adults use
Okay,
cannabis. We've got
so-
it up here. 6.6% of adults use cannabis. 16 to 24-year-olds, it's 16.4%. So I think not huge, but a significant number. But Carol, just, you know, when I was listening to you, what you said made a lot of sense to me until I kind of had to then match it with what you said at the beginning of the show, which is that we all find alcohol very socially acceptable. You know, Karen's got a beer business, which is very popular. We all enjoy drinking in summer.
Responsible drinking.
That's why
Exactly.
we're running out of CO2.
Right.
But it's a widely accepted medical and political fact that alcohol is more harmful than cannabis.
That's not true. That's simply
but it's
not
the
true.
fact.
Simply not
a
true.
fact.
Simply not true. The fact is that people who smoke 3 cannabis joints a day are in more danger than people who smoke 20 cigarettes a day. And that's been put out by the NHS.
There's no question about it. And I've seen this, sadly, from my own family experience. If somebody smokes cannabis regularly on a daily basis, it affects them entirely. It's got huge psychotic,
If
mental
somebody
effects.
drinks alcohol
and-
regularly on a daily basis.
This is completely different. This is completely different.
I'm talking
But
about
on the other hand,
peer-reviewed
on the other hand,
reports
I
in the
think
Lancet that are accepted by the medical establishment. That
there
alcohol
are
is
medical. I think
a
we're not
harmful
comparing
drug.
alcohol and cannabis here. The issue over here was triggered by this child who couldn't get the medical cannabis that he required, and I think on that score, we should definitely look to legalizing medical cannabis. In the same way, look at opioids. Look at opioids. They're far more addicted. I mean, if anyone's had an operation and you've been on morphine, you need it for the pain, but it's addictive.
Yeah.
And yet, it's legalized.
As
And it's
you've
allowed. And I
mentioned-
think we should definitely allow for cannabis, for medical reasons, to be legalized.
Case by case.
What's brought this debate about is, of course, these 2 children you talk of, Alfie Dingley and Billy Caldwell. And here's Charlotte Caldwell, mother of Billy.
I never want to see or hear of another mother in our country having to endure or watch their child endure what Billy has endured this week. Medicine confiscated based on bureaucracy, old, outdated policies and laws. These children have to be medically assessed. It's medical advice. That's what this has to be based on.
Now, that mum was on my show, and within 24 hours of the boy not having the drug, he was having seizures or fitting, whatever you want, at the rate of about 100 per day. And the drug helps. I don't know necessarily we want to go down the argument here of legalisation versus decriminalisation. Take up your point, Karen, and I think we're on the same page. We accept drugs made of opium because they know they can help, although there's an issue going on at Gosport Hospital, which is a story just breaking as we speak. So we know that. So if we can take drugs from opium, why, for the love of all's holy, can we not take cannabis for oil at the strength that they use in Canada? It seems to me an absolute
Can we
circumstance.
Javid just quickly, because he is the Home Secretary who has been talking about this, and well, let's hear exactly what he says.
The position that we find ourselves in currently is not satisfactory. It's not satisfactory for the parents, it's not satisfactory for the doctors, and it's not satisfactory for me. I've now come to the conclusion that it is time to review the scheduling of cannabis. This step is in no way a first step to the legalisation of cannabis for recreational use. This government has absolutely no plans to legalise cannabis, and the penalties for unauthorised supply and possession will remain unchanged.
Obviously, the government is trying to very clearly distinguish what you're talking about for medical use and the legalisation of cannabis for recreational use. I am not somebody who thinks that legalising cannabis will solve all of our problems with drugs. There's, you know, the evidence from other states and countries that have legalised it is that it doesn't necessarily solve problems, and sometimes it creates more. However, I do think we need to scrutinise our cultural attitudes towards cannabis, because for me, there's a huge discrepancy between our attitudes towards socially acceptable drugs, which are more harmful, including alcohol and tobacco. I drink alcohol. You know, most of the people I know drink alcohol. There's no taboo around it, but it has no medicinal benefits, and it is known to be harmful. And I can't understand why we have this block.
Actually, by the way, no medicinal. There are lots of research that shows that beer in moderation is actually good for the health.
And one glass of
Good
red.
look, Karen.
And red wine.
I think it's a capful of red wine, not a glass.
Karen, one more point. I just want to make one. We mustn't miss this. Another argument that is made to legalise recreational cannabis is that it'll bring in. There's one study that it brings in £1 billion net more to the economy. I don't think we should do it.
No, I mean,
that argument doesn't work. I think
how
medicinal,
greedy
yes,
and irresponsible of a government.
Cannot be legalised.
How greedy and irresponsible of a government to legalise something and rake in tax billions, knowing that it causes harm. But before, I just want to make this point about medicinal cannabis. There's a guy called Dr. David Robert Grant. He is a researcher. He's a physicist. He says that the reality is most health claims made about cannabis are wrong. And they're devoid of evidence. They risk endangering the lives of the very people they're supposed to help. Yes, there is definite evidence that it helps people with epilepsy. There is a small amount of evidence that it helps chronic pain, and an even smaller amount that it helps people taking cancer drugs. It stops the nausea, but the caveat is it can also create nausea. But, you know, and I'm looking at Charlotte Caldwell here, and this story emerges. We thank God her boy has got it, because I think on a case-by-case basis good. But let's not forget Charlotte Caldwell is the sole director of a distribution company that makes cannabis oil.
Doesn't matter if it helps her son.
No
wonder she's got a passion for it.
There's a vested interest, and I would have actually more time for people who were campaigning for the legalisation of medical cannabis if many of them weren't wrapped up in campaigns to legalise it for recreational
By the way, the
use.
country was outraged when that was confiscated by the Home
Yes,
Office.
I get that.
The whole country was
But
outraged.
it's got to be in a case-by-case
I have a
basis.
mate who has at the moment got cancer pretty seriously, who takes cannabis oil every day. And he says it's helping. Now, whether it's helping or not, it seems to me it doesn't matter. If he's taking it and he thinks it's helping, then it's got some chance of helping.
And I must pour cannabis oil on those troubled waters because we move on. And it's time again to play one of my favourite games, Compare and Contrast. Today's example, how to handle a migrant crisis. Now, in the US, tearing screaming children from the arms of their sobbing parents as they seek to enter at the Mexican border, possibly illegally, was, until recently, deemed appropriate. The children were then kept in cages, usually without books or toys. Now, in Germany, we have Angela Merkel's creaking coalition government, possibly about to collapse due to pressures created by her open-door policy for migrants. Meanwhile, on World Refugee Day this week, it was revealed more than 34,000 have died trying to get to Europe in the last 25 years. Migration is one of the biggest issues facing the world. Neither Mr. Trump, with his brutal attempts at deterrence, or Frau Merkel, whose waiting welcome has seen thousands perish, has the answer. But we do need one, and we need it fast.
Nick, you say we need an answer. I don't think there is an answer, especially in Europe. You know, the melting pot, I don't think, can be salvaged there. I don't think anyone could look at what's happening in Germany or in Italy or in lots of the other countries across the EU and say that it's actually working. You know, the populists are on the march in countries like the Czech Republic and Italy, Poland. And it's interesting you mentioned Trump, and it's hideous what he's doing. You know, you don't want to be part of a country that does that. But it's interesting that Trump threatened to erect a wall to keep Mexicans out of the US. But what we never talk about here is the fact that in Europe, they've erected walls all over Europe. Hungary have erected walls to keep out migrants. Austria has. Bulgaria has. You know, the mood is changing, and it's changing because of Mrs. Merkel's immigration policy to let 1 million+ immigrants in. It's caused chaos. It's changed cultures overnight in some countries. You know, there are 11 populist parties now across the EU, and all of them have more than 20% support. You guys will have heard of a historian called Niall Ferguson. He said this week, Italy's populists are the future, Merkel is the past. And what Mrs. Merkel has done with this open-door policy, she's fractured Europe. It's ironic. She's actually split Europe.
Let's bring Greg in after. I just want to read this. France's finance minister, effectively their chancellor, Bruno Le Maire, says Europe is in a process of disintegration. We see states that are turning inward, trying to find national solutions to problems that require European solutions. That's about as grim as it gets, isn't it, Greg?
I think it is. But is there a solution? I mean, we're making the assumption that because we have a political problem, there is always a political solution. I'm not at all sure. When you get movements of population on the scale we've seen in recent years.
68 million people on the move last year.
Yeah,
68 million.
But of course, if you actually look at the figures of coming into EU, you know, Greece 25,000, Italy 78,000, Germany 524,000, France 110,000, and the UK 28,000.
Karen, I want to bring you in just briefly. Angela Merkel, who you mentioned, and Emmanuel Macron had a meeting this week, and they talked about possibly building detention centres in Libya or in Niger or places like that. I want to hear your point, but your reaction to that idea.
So you see, the problem was, if you look at the figures, In 2015, there were 1.3 million asylum applicants in the EU. And this is very much linked to Brexit. Because in 2016, the year after that, if you polled people then, number one issue, 60% of them said their fear of immigration was number one issue, 60%. Now that's dropped to as low as 30% because even the numbers have now dropped. The asylum seekers now have come down to half the 1.3 million.
Well, the figures I've got are 2.4 million migrants in
Let's not get hung up too much.
2016.
But what about the idea of building these camps, Karen?
No, so I want to just make this point.
Go on.
That there's this perception and fear of migration which was at its peak. If you remember Nigel Farage and those pictures of queues of migrants coming in, that really, really scared the British public before, and immigration became a number one issue. It is not any longer. The fear of immigration is nowhere near as far as it was. No, that's what the statistics show. There are graphs that showed coming down from 60% down to 30%.
Rising up across Europe.
But
it's
still,
simply not true.
what Angela Merkel did, by the way, she now realizes a mistake to have an open door policy.
Yes.
We've got to control immigration.
Okay.
What we have lost control of is the illegal immigration. You know, in the UK alone, the former head of the Borders Agency, after he retired, he said, I don't know how many illegal immigrants. There may be up to 1 million illegal immigrants.
Can I answer that question that you just asked there?
Quickly, because I want to get after it.
Only because
is this about the camps?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, camps at site.
Remember when David Cameron, when we were all talking about taking in asylum seekers from Syria and wherever, and remember David Cameron said the policy was build camps over there, and everyone poo-pooed that in Europe, and they said, no, you're being cruel, you're being hideous. And now Merkel and Macron are saying it's a good idea.
So I think it's really interesting to look at what's happened to Trump and the US debate, because I think it shows how even somebody who is so hardline about closing down borders has to eventually make some concessions to basic humanity. So unfortunately, it falls to me to play this, which I find really hard to watch, segment from a really excellent report from Greg Milam on Sky News. Just have a look at this, and this is what we know now has been going on in the US.
They are the cries of young children, reportedly after they were taken from their parents inside a US detention centre last week. The campaigners who obtained this recording say it reveals the truth of the forced separation of thousands of migrant families.
No llores. Vas a llegar con... Mira, ella te va a explicar y te va a ayudar.
This is what it looks like inside the largest of those detention centres. Hundreds of children held in cages with just tin foil blankets for comfort. The innocents caught in the middle of Donald Trump's zero tolerance on illegal border crossings.
It is, and I don't use the word lightly, genuinely heartbreaking, and so much so that even the Republican right have been piling pressure on Trump. And this is what he's now said, as I'm sure you've heard, that he's had to retract from his position.
Today, I signed an executive order. We're going to keep families together, but the border is going to be just as tough as it's been.
And I mentioned that, and I just finally, the last thing I want to show you, which is a paper I'm very proud of, The Guardian, which used World Refugee Day to publish a list of the 34,361 documented, I'm sure there are many more, migrants. And it says not just the name and the country of origin, but how they died. And there is just, some of these facts are heartbreaking. I just say that to say, digging your head in the sand is not a solution. This is a crisis.
How is that worse, those kiddies screaming in cages, than kiddies drowning?
It's not worse. No, it's not.
And that's Merkel's policy.
And just let me finish my point.
But that's Merkel's policy.
No, the problem with this is no one politician can solve this. And shutting your border, this is a problem that people are leaving, and they are leaving for a reason. And just by closing your borders,
I just want to build on this
problem.
because there is a difference between economic migrants and genuine refugees. I mean, countries like Turkey have over 2 million, Jordan, millions of refugees, genuine refugees who are fleeing conflict and terror. On the other hand, what about the humanitarian aspect where people come in these boats and on sea, and there's a report from the Sky News presenter Mark Stone out at sea with the ship, the Aquarius.
Yes.
We should see what this is the reality.
Okay. You can see the Aquarius just over there, probably a couple hundred metres away from where we are now. Surrounding it are Spanish Coast Guard vessels who, for understandable reasons, are keeping us back. But we're getting a close glimpse there of a vessel which really has summed up the mess that Europe is in over migration very neatly over the course of the past week. On board are 106 people who are not in a good state. They are at the end of a very, very long journey which has taken them from their countries in Central Africa, across the Sahara Desert with the help of traffickers, into lawless Libya, and then onto those dinghies into the Mediterranean that we've seen so many times before.
This is where we have a responsibility, a humanitarian response to rescue these people from sea, and then now they've been accepted by Spain.
But, I mean, what was really worrying about the Trump thing, I mean, I don't know if you've heard, but that they think some of these kids will never find their parents again. They don't know. They've just sent them off. They've just sent them off somewhere. It's terrifying. But remember, I mean, we think this is a European problem. Actually, it's not really. If you look at the number of refugees around the world, you know, Turkey, Pakistan, Lebanon, Iran, Uganda, Ethiopia, Jordan are the top 7. So the idea that this is just a European problem is not the case. Germany is. The real issue is that there are, for a combination of reasons, I suspect partly about communications, partly about globalisation, people are getting up and moving in large numbers to try to get a better life.
Yeah, European destination.
Yes, and we don't quite know what to do about it. We haven't got a solution.
The predicted numbers for the people coming from sub-Saharan countries, it's 13.6 million by 2050. That's a lot of people, and all of them are heading towards Europe. So
it's a global problem as well with the US and Canada.
On the other hand, this is where, one, we're an island, secondly, we're not part of Schengen. And so this is a big benefit to us, that we're not part of Schengen. On the other hand, we have responsibility as well.
And do you know, it was Mrs. Thatcher who actually stopped us going into it. She said, remember, this will affect people's livelihoods in this country, and it will, she mentioned crime as well. I mean, how wise all that sounds.
It's good to see that Mrs. Thatcher managed to get Mrs. Thatcher in this just for a change. To move from something terribly serious to something much more trivial, for a football fanatic like me, the problem with the World Cup is that thousands of people who take no interest in football for the previous 4 years suddenly become experts and insist on talking about it. For a whole month, these new fair-weather fans, who are disproportionately, but not exclusively female, insist on telling those of us who love the game what is happening, who is playing well, who fouled who, and who is offside, without having any knowledge of the game at all. To be polite and to make sure that they don't grab the remote control and turn off the match, we are supposed to listen to their views and encourage them. Enough is enough. The time has come in every pub and in every house for there to be one telly set aside for the real fans in one room and another for these Johnny-come-latelys to football in a different room. Then us real fans can go back to enjoying football in peace.
I just need to take a minute to calm down, Greg, because you really had to go there, didn't you? I wonder if that was you specifically dropped that most of them are women thing just to extra wind me up. Greg, as the former chair of the FA, what is the point of global football events like the World Cup? What is the actual point?
Oh, the actual point is a competition between nations.
And who is meant to be engaged by that competition?
Everybody.
Oh, really?
Listen, I'm not saying...
And is my gender included in this?
No, it's nothing to do with gender.
Oh, really? Because I swear I heard you say
no, it's nothing to do with
that it was especially women who
No, I said it's disproportionately women, but it's certainly not only women, and also there are an awful lot of women who do know a lot about football.
And women's football is escalating popularity.
It is. It is going up, certainly in this country, where the FA are doing a really good job in encouraging women's
Well, on women's football, I would like to point out that our women's team in England are ranked second in the world.
Yes, sure.
And they reached the semi-finals of the European Championship, and they do so under incredibly difficult conditions compared to our pampered male
And I'd be
players.
very happy to watch all sorts of games with those people because they love football, they care about it. All I'm talking about is this strange group of people who don't care.
Strange.
Who don't care. Shh.
No. Do you know how snotty and arrogant you sound in saying this? You know, this is a bunch of blokes kicking a ball around, for God's sake. It's not rocket science. But we sit round this table every week, and we're not experts, and we talk about stuff. And all you're saying
some
is
of us try to understand it better than others.
Well, and I understand it perfectly. What I understand about you is you're saying women shouldn't have any right to talk about football.
No,
and only people like yourself who understand
It doesn't say that at all.
Game.
It says there are some people who love football and it's their life. And there are others...
It's their life.
Can we look at this?
Is it your life?
It's a big bit of my life.
Can I just take a positive slant on this?
Yeah.
The fact is, when the World Cup takes place, it's really good
For
the
beer.
whole
You sell a
world.
lot of beer.
It is good for beer.
Well,
It is
we
good
have
for
to
beer.
call
I know
it
that.
that.
I declare my interest. It's great for beer. But it is also very good for the economy in general. But it's also great globally. I mean, look at the... 1 billion people will watch the final. In this country, the excitement, the economic benefit, and also you need these extra people, by the way, because there aren't... but there aren't enough presenters. There aren't enough presenters. You have to bring in other people.
Let me just show you
to cope with the
a
popularity.
clip.
And one more thing, the royal family, the wedding, such a popular event.
Yeah.
Huge success. More people watched the opening England match, almost 20 million
Yes.
people.
18.3 million,
which is
Karen,
phenomenal.
I have
almost 20 million.
70% of the viewing public.
I have absolutely no problem with everybody watching it. All I'm saying is...
shouldn't have an opinion.
All I'm saying is there are some of us who would quite like to watch it without being interrupted by people who don't know anything about
Greg,
it.
I wonder if I could just get in, because I often like to look at back copies of the pledge and remind myself of certain things that were said. I wonder if we could go back to June 2016, Greg, when you said this.
We didn't have a bad squad. We had quite a good squad. We went out there. We played OK. We should in the first 3 games, and then we were terrible in the 4th. And I think everybody knows that. I mean, from behalf of the FA, I just say I'm sorry. You know.
So you accept you're no expert, and now you're deciding that you shouldn't be allowed to watch the games.
Pick the team. Now, all I'm saying is that
you've got to be in the wrong room.
There are some people who care passionately about football and who go every week, and you can see something. Here, just take a look at this. This was in Leeds. This was on the night of the first England game.
Yes.
Now, if you look at that, that's a bunch of people who clearly love the game. It's they've paid to get in there. It's part of their lives, and that's an important thing. All I'm saying is, some of us don't want to... I don't want to... I mean, for instance, someone suggested to me when I was at the BBC that actually they should have a different feed for people, totally different television feed for people who weren't really interested in the football, just wanted to watch the men run around.
Karen, indulge me for 5 seconds. Indulge me for 5 seconds. Just indulge, because you are strictly looking at those fans. Can I please take you to Plymouth with some England fans?
Oh my God.
Again, no. Let's look at...
And there he goes. And those are real fans. And that's Big Phil Campion. He was just... That's Phil celebrating.
But again, please look at the positive aspect. The English Premier League is one of Britain's greatest elements of soft power. I mean, the popularity around the world. If you look at a team, look at a team, the big teams, Manchester United, Chelsea's, the supporters they have around the world. You're talking about millions of supporters around the world. Asia Pacific, for example, half the supporters are based over there. So this is great for Britain. This is great for our soft power.
Can I make a serious point
I think it's
as well?
fantastic.
There is a serious side to this, Greg.
Yes,
there is a serious side to this. I'm not really one to buy into these arguments that if you have women in the room, then things are much more conciliatory. But if you want an example of what happens when you get a group of men together and let them run something, FIFA is the perfect storm.
Yes.
Corruption,
to the core.
Corrupt bids. Slave labour in constructing
I should tell you
World
the
Cup
former
venues,
chief...
the sex trade rocketing...
I agree that I should
World
tell you the
Cups
former chief...
If women were more involved in football, it would be
Why have you come dressed as Bobby Moore? No, I have a legal intervention which has to be the most bizarre that I've ever had to tell you. We have to urge fans not to do that at home. We've just seen... So there's my fun gone on Saturday.
Mine is quite I thought this week I'd do a bit of trivial. I'm glad I can still wind you up with something that's so trivial. All I'm saying is I'd like to be able to watch football. I'd like to be able to watch the game with people who care about the game.
Who's stopping you from doing that?
I'm not.
And it's not trivial. And you know
it's just
what?
a part of a debate. That's what we do every week, isn't it?
There are female sports commentators and journalists who still get treated terribly because of those kind of stereotypes.
I think that's changed. I think that's changed massively.
You should spend some time
I tell you what, Raf was right.
them.
The BBC had its first ever female commentary of a World Cup game this week. And some of the... I did this on the show today.
Unbelievable.
Some of the reaction... I mean, really... ugly.
I
And
give
they
you
all sounded
I give
great.
you Exhibit A. It's these kind of ideas
you're
that women have
taking
no
this
right
way.
to comment
All
on.
I'm saying is there are some people who follow football the whole time, really enjoy it, and there are others who come in and out. And I'd rather watch football with the ones who love it and follow it.
To make a not so serious point, the fact it's splattered all over our TV screens all day long means that none of us have much else to talk about. Of course you're going to have an opinion on something that takes over all of your living room.
I could solve that with you,
for a
Carol.
month.
Brexit. There we go.
But Carol, that's why I'm suggesting you get a second set in the other room, and then you can watch what you like.
The most important thing is England has to do well. If they do well, that'll be great.
Always the case. If England do well, then we all feel good. Harold Wilson still believes, or believed until the time he died, that he lost the 1970 election because England had got knocked out of the World Cup on the Sunday.
Well, on the note that England is going to do well, coming up after the break, why I think money for our armed forces should be a top priority for our government. Our armed forces are recognised and respected around the world as being the finest and most professional, the best of the best. Yet these are amongst the most dangerous and trying times globally we've ever faced. But the British Army is so small it can't even fill Wembley Stadium. Chancellor Philip Hammond says a new budget chest unlocked for the NHS leaves no funds for other departments, including the Ministry of Defence. The current NATO target to spend at least 2% of GDP on defence is nowhere enough. A group of MPs says we need to increase spending on this area by up to £20 billion a year to enable our armed forces to be able to keep our country secure and operate globally in a proactive and reactive way. The government's #1 priority is the defence of its citizens. This government should be disgraced at finding itself so critically short of funds to do so.
Well, you're not alone, of course, thinking that. There was a parliamentary report published earlier this month, probably, that you saw across all parties that agreed more money needs to be spent. I've got a couple of observations. I don't know, I sense you saw the same report in the Times as I did, that first cabinet meeting after the weekend, where Philip Hammond said, I'd love Rachel to have been here, because her brother then realised that he's got no money, defence has got no money, housing has got no money, education's got no money. It's all going to the NHS. That's probably a debate for another day. Two things. Yes, you're right, of course, if we can. £20 billion is a lot of money. Karen, I don't know that we need conventional armed forces in the way that you might be describing. If you consider that this week there's been a report published, Euro-wide, by Europol, European-wide, more than 200 terror plots that were either foiled, stopped or went ahead, or failed, I'm sorry. More than half were in the UK, more than half, so terror capital of Europe. You don't fight that, I don't think, with tanks, with aircraft, with ships, with soldiers, with Navy personnel. So if you're going to spend that money, I'd like to know how you're going to spend it, because I don't think buying loads of boats on the ground works.
Yes, well, there are two issues here. One is you need a critical mass of boots on the ground. Whatever way you look at it, our combined armed forces now are around 150,000. I mean, my father was Commander-in-Chief of the Central Indian Army. The Central Indian Army alone has 350,000 troops. We're talking about threats from Russia.
But your dad's was in a different time, Karen.
But we're talking, even today, if you look at America and China, their defence spending and their scale is in a completely different level to ours. We're the fifth largest spender of defence. So let's not get it. You know, we are still a big spender, £36 billion a year. We're #5 in the world, but we are short of troops at the moment. We're understaffed, about 10,000 shortage across our defence forces. But we're also, as you correctly say, Nick, we're fighting a hybrid warfare today in the world. Right. And for that hybrid warfare, you still need investment. You still need investment in our nuclear deterrent. The nuclear deterrent used to be funded by the Treasury. Now that's put into the defence budget to make up this 2% figure. Earlier it used to be within the Treasury. Pensions used to be somewhere else. Now that's been put into the 2%.
But nuclear isn't a new warfare,
No, but there's been a cut in real terms, and a huge cut in our defence compared to, say, the 1990s. We used to spend 3% of our GDP on defence, and in my view, the world has got much more dangerous. Just one more point to make. We have the finest troops in the world. The Gurkhas, the Paras, the Special Forces, the Guards. The whole world respects our defence forces being the best in the world. They need to be properly resourced.
Can I just show you what Chairman of the Defence Committee, Dr. Julian Lewis, says about this?
If you invest in defence in peacetime, by paying the premiums and making yourselves stronger, you actually make it less likely that the disaster will happen, because the disaster we wish to avert is a full-scale conflict, and you tend not to have full-scale conflicts when your potential adversaries know that you're strong.
I interviewed a guy called James Glancy last year, much decorated war hero from Afghanistan, won the Gallantry Medal. He and a group of military heavyweights sent a letter to Theresa May last year saying that we no longer have a credible army, navy or RAF. You know, we could no longer fight a conventional war. We're getting to the position where we no longer have enough troops to even act and to help allied forces. They're talking about banning our amphibious ships, which means we can't even go and help out people in disasters anymore. And it just seems crazy to me that on a world stage, you know, this guy Glancy said to me last year that the government says it's spending 2% of its GDP. He doesn't believe that, but what he says is, even if they are, it needs to be 3%. And this Commons Defence Committee says exactly the same.
And we haven't had aircraft carrier capability, which are coming up to almost 1 decade with everything we've been through. If you think of what we've been through in the last decade, and we haven't had aircraft carrier capability, I find that absolutely shocking.
But you're happy, because we have this discussion about tax many times around here. I mean, it's quite clear that we are going to pay increased taxes to pay for the additional money going to National Health Service. You're quite happy to pay increased taxes, all of it. You always...
No, I'm not.
So you don't want to pay increased taxes to have a bigger army, bigger navy, bigger air force. So how do you pay for it?
Well,
I thought you meant for the NHS. I thought you meant the NHS.
Sure, but no,
That's so disingenuous. You know, there may be efficiencies, but not enough to fund what we need. And I really feel listening to... I kind of agree with you, Nick. It feels strange. Listening to you, Karen, this feels like the real issue here is about the fact that our position in the world has changed. Why are we competing with China and Russia and India? We're a much smaller nation. We no longer have an empire. You know, and I think that actually underneath this is the conversation that needs to take place. Where should we be positioning ourselves? What kind of armed capability do we need? And also, this whole debate does feel like it's stuck in another era to me. One of the biggest threats, I mean, you mentioned the way threats evolve, but we haven't talked about cyber warfare and disinformation. This is how states are now threatening the very nature of our democracy. Our government don't even understand this technology and how it works. Our military intelligence agencies don't fully understand it. We need to be working out how to create a genuinely modern security force that can protect us from...
A red letter day in your red outfit because you agree with President Donald Trump. Take a look at this.
But our destiny beyond the earth is not only a matter of national identity, but a matter of national security. So important for our military. Very importantly, I'm hereby directing the Department of Defense and Pentagon to immediately begin the process necessary to establish a Space Force as the 6th branch of the armed forces.
Trump there clearly channeling Buzz Lightyear to infinity and beyond. And while I have the microphone, just a couple of points. Of course, let's remind viewers we do have the Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier now, Karan, and the Ministry of Defence wants to say the following: the Defence Secretary launched the Modernising Defence Programme to strengthen our armed forces in the face of intensifying threats, and while we welcome the Defence Committee's preliminary report, we will not speculate on the outcome of the programme before we share our headline conclusions. The UK maintains the biggest defence budget in Europe, and we have been clear we will continue to exceed NATO's 2% spending target.
And this we've got to remember, that the main objective of our armed forces, of all this investment, is not to fight, but to keep the peace. Because soft power is useless without hard power, and we need that hard power to be able to... And here is the new Chief of the General Staff, who's from a Special Forces background, General Mark Carlton Smith. This is what he has to say. We need a more proactive, threat-based approach to our capability planning, including placing big bets on those technologies that we judge may offer exponential advantage, because given the pace of the race, to fall behind today is to cede an almost unquantifiable advantage from which it might be impossible to recover. So we can't fall behind. To your point, Afua, we cannot fall behind.
Let's just remind ourselves, our current defence spending is £36 billion, which is not a small number. If you had the extra 20 billion you think we need today, would our armed forces be able to spend that in the most strategic way on the realistically evolving threat that we face? I think that we need to work out a coherent strategy before any extra money would actually do what it needs to do. I don't think we're there yet, in all honesty.
Without a doubt that they would be able to. Greg,
Well, I mean, of course, you can't look at this without going back to Afghanistan and Iraq and say, you know, we didn't need to go into Iraq. If having less troops means we don't go into Iraq, then I'm all for it, in all honesty. I don't think what you do need... I mean, when you talk about defence of the nation, we all agree that's the role of government. What we don't necessarily say is to do sort of different things all over the world, often to our disadvantage, is what's happened certainly with Iraq and Afghanistan.
But that's not an excuse for cutting numbers. I mean, you mentioned numbers before. Let's look at some of these numbers that we have here. We're down to 81,700 soldiers, 33,450 Navy, 32,800. That's nothing. It's a total of about 140,000, as you said. It doesn't even fill the stadium.
We spend more than any other country in Europe. Right? We spend more on defence than any other country.
What are we spending it on? Because
now the question is,
and we're one of the few to meet our NATO commitment.
If we wanted to, you'd have to say, what do we wish to spend? I mean, for instance, I suspect the Ministry of Defence has always been the least efficient of all the government departments. Right? Well, you know, more people, I think, in the Ministry of Defence than in any of those numbers.
But you see, one of the points that the Chief of the General Staff has made is you've got to be able to be proactive on one sense, and you can argue what is that proactive in today's hybrid warfare world, but you've also got to be able to be reactive. You can't forecast things like September the 11th. They happened overnight with no prediction whatsoever. But you've then got to have a force that is able to react immediately.
But have you never ever had a chairman of the defence, what's his name? Have you ever had a situation where they have asked for less? Have you ever had a situation where they haven't asked for more?
You could about Carlton Smith.
Well, all government departments
he is going to say that,
ask for more money.
Consistently. No, but Defence has had real-term cuts. If you look going back to 2010 review, as have most departments, I know, but the security of the nation is by far the #1 priority of any government.
But security isn't the same.
This is a big part of it.
As having a massive force that allows you to go and do things around the world.
Massive. It's already tiny. It's already way, way smaller than it should be. I think it's critically tiny, and it's irresponsible to have it so low at this stage.
OK, well, it's time to defend my part of the debate now. People, you're watching The Pledge on Sky News. Coming up, I'm arguing companies are getting too personal. Writer George Orwell, who coined the concept Big Brother, predicted so much about our modern life with his thoughts about constant surveillance. But the one thing he got wrong was his imagining that the government would brutally infringe on our privacy. How could he have imagined that, in fact, it would be us happily giving our data away to private companies that would represent the biggest threat? When I recently joined a new gym, they casually demanded a sample of my DNA. Some ancestry testing companies keep the data we give them and share it with pharmaceutical companies. Store loyalty cards now collect so much information about what contraception or toiletries we buy, they can tell if we're having an affair. And let's not forget Facebook, which has access to unprecedented levels of intimate imagery and information about our friends, family, and personal history. Much of this tech provides amazing opportunities to improve and enhance our lives. But why aren't we asking more about the ultimate cost? Can I just say I'm enjoying the collective shock?
So that's how I rumbled. Bloody supermarket card. That's how she found out.
So what we've got to realise here, and I think we often miss this, is it's moving so quickly. If you think about the Data Protection Act, when it came out, was over 20 years ago. Over 20 years ago, the internet had barely started. The well-known internet names that are all household names today had barely started. And now it's moved at the speed of light, that 20 years later, and I don't think we've kept up with it. And we've taken full advantage of it. Businesses have, consumers have. We're all just take it for granted. But there's a bad side to it as well. And we're now catching up. And the data part is more data has been created in the last few years than the whole of history together. That's how quickly things are moving. So now we've got this new regulation, that's an EU regulation, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. That is now in force. to try and get on top of this so we have some control over this, so individuals have some control over this vast amount of data that is out there. And by the way, it is EU regulation, but we in Britain have written a lot of it and asked for it, and we're going to benefit from it as well.
But the problem with the GDPR is, and I'm sure you've all had this experience, in fact, to research this topic today, the number of times I had to tick a box on a website saying, I consent to, and a long list of things. If you want to use modern information services, you have to consent, and you don't know exactly what it means when they ask you about cookies and data. And, you know, I'm a lawyer, and I can't read the pages of terms that I'm asked to sign up to. How is the ordinary internet user expected to really be able to stay on top of the way they're giving their data away? I just want to go to the example of store cards, because there are lots of people in my life who go to quite extreme lengths to get a few extra points on a store loyalty card, you know, to get that £1 off voucher. And I sometimes say to them, have you thought through what that £1 off voucher is costing you? And this is a quote from the head of retail research at Knight Frank, who explained why stores offer these discounts. And he said, the end game for retailers is not to win over the odd customer with the promise of a few money off vouchers, but to forge as deep an understanding of an individual's shopping patterns as possible, to know where they live, which stores they frequent, how often they visit, how much they spend, and each individual item they buy, and how their online and offline behaviours interrelate. So this isn't like a conspiracy theory. This is the overt justification as to why companies invest in collecting data about it.
But I have to tell you, Afua, I don't think your proper ordinary person gives a stuff about privacy.
Well, that's why I worry.
I really don't. I think the only people that care and bang on about privacy are the liberal elite, certain sections of the media, and certain lefties. But, you know, if you ask people to sacrifice their privacy in order to catch terrorists or criminals, they'd be absolutely willing to do that. But I do think as well that as a society, we're not interested in protecting our privacy. People, you know, our phone maps every move we make, everything we do. Every credit card purchase is a forever record of what we buy. You know, people are sending photos around the world every day. They're sending stuff about their experiences, what they eat,
Trillions
what they do.
of photographs a year.
We're driven by a vain impulse to broadcast ourselves.
When your Jim asked you for the DNA,
I refused.
Did they? I'm
why?
damn straight you did. But did you? Did they say why?
Well, yeah, the reason is they claim that they can then offer me a tailor-made health and nutritional programme that's designed to meet my specific genetic needs. And, you know, I don't have a problem with the technology of being able to get very specific about health programmes based on your body, but the issue I had was when I asked them about the data protection around my DNA, they weren't able to guarantee that they would never share it with a third party, that it would never be sold.
You see,
and the most alarmingly, they said no one else had ever asked them.
To what Carol said, I think ordinary people, if their bank accounts are hacked, if they have money taken out of their account, if they have problems with their communications provider, I think that does affect normal people. Where I think you're right, and you would probably agree, is we are too glib. A lot of this we bring on ourselves. We give too many details.
How often do the thing comes through on the computer? You know, it comes, you have to tick something. So you just, are you not read it? You just tick it. They could be taking away your children and your house and everything. You wouldn't know. You just tick it.
That's where that house went.
No, that was the ex-wife, I'm afraid.
For people to get angry, to get riled about this, when they don't actually know, there's nothing to point them to what access to your data can do.
Yeah.
That's why it's difficult for people to get angry about it.
That's kind of why we're having this debate, Carol. You know, and you kind of said this is a liberal elite kind of thing.
But there
are already cases where the police have, using facial recognition technology, misidentified people and attempted to prosecute them based on misunderstanding or misapplying this technology. And you know, this whole idea of genetic testing is the police tried to build up this big DNA database. People don't realise that you don't catch criminals through DNA. You use it when you have a suspect based on traditional intelligence and policing. Then you can use DNA to corroborate that it was them. But the idea of having these huge dragnets, because they get it wrong.
But you know what's enabling
I get it wrong a few times, but I bet they get it right a lot more.
Again, this is the point I made earlier on, the speed at which this is happening. There's also another aspect to it, is it's getting cheaper and cheaper and affordable to do DNA testing. It wasn't long ago that it cost $100 million to analyse DNA. Now it's less than $1,000.
Some of
it's going to come down to be so...
I did. I'm a complete contradiction in all this. I refused to have store cards for exactly what you are, and then I sent my DNA off to somebody just to find out. And worst thing, I got given it as a present. It never came back.
It's an ancestry test.
Oh, yes.
One of these...
yes, I wanted to find out from whence the dykes really come. And, well, I never found out.
Well, I could tell you, but it's unfortunately it won't go to air.
Exactly what you're talking about. I had one to determine, because I was going on an eating programme, and the DNA test I had, it said what I should eat, because what my body liked, what it needed, what it was missing. So, I mean, I think they're very useful.
So did you find out what else they might do with your data when you give it to them?
Do you know, I don't even care.
Because what if one day, Carol, you wanted health insurance and it was denied because of a test you never consented to give to a company you never consented to give it to?
Health insurance is never going to be denied as long as I pay for it.
The point is, there are things that you can't yet foresee might affect you that you might be giving away.
That's why people can't get upset about it,
but that's
because
why,
they don't know what's going to happen.
I raised topic. I realise that people are complacent. I'm on Instagram. You know, I've given away images of my personal life, and we all do it. It's not me saying that I am above everyone. I'm saying we're all complicit in this. But we need to stop and ask what exactly we are giving away.
What about the other aspect of all this? How this data is used in terms of elections? I mean, this is a topic we could talk about the whole time. Yeah. The interference in elections, whether it was a referendum, whether it's the Russians interfering, supposedly, you know, there are all these issues as well.
All right, well, we'll never know whether he's a noble or commoner, Greg Dyke, but what we all do know is that we like a bit of respect every now and then. And when you're the leader of a country, it's not unreasonable to expect protocol to be followed. But French President Emmanuel Macron rather overstepped the mark this week when he berated a teenager who dared to call him by his nickname Manu.
You can act like a clown, but today it is the Marseillaise, and you call me Mr. President or Mr., OK? You need to do things the right way. Even if you want to lead a revolution one day, you first got to earn a diploma and learn how to put food on the table, OK?
Well, it might not have been pretty, but for putting that teenager in his place, Monsieur le Président, you have to get our straight parlour, or should that be talker, of the week. Greg, I saw you chuckling. I thought that was a bit out of character, really.
Well, I quite liked it.
Did you?
Yes, I quite... Because no one expects it.
No.
I love free when somebody does something that's completely out of character and just says, look, just behave yourself, get on with it.
Well, Trump had done that, Afua.
This is the person who first began his affair with his wife when he was a schoolboy. I mean, he's got a bit of a nerve.
Well, you know, at Cambridge University, King's College, one of the dons there, the porter, didn't address her as Doctor.
Yes.
And she got very upset about this. And, of course, the porter couldn't give a damn.
But it's like...
Porters always...
It's like when somebody first gets a title,
roost.
isn't it? They get very snotty about it and insist on being called. He's barely had it for 5 minutes. I think he's probably just jealous of that boy who's going to grow up to be a film star at some point.
From all of us and the good Lord, the Lemuria. That's it for this week. Thanks for watching The Pledge.